Welcome to Managing Sexuality Intelligently. My name is Jason, and I'm here with Stephen Ng, marriage and family therapist. Stephen, thank you for joining us.
Oh, you're welcome.
It's been a pleasure to do this with you, or this is the first episode, but I've been working with Steve for a couple of years now. I manage his social media, edit his articles for Psychology Today, and perform other marketing duties. This podcast is an exploration into Steve's life work, which revolves around the idea of managing sexuality intelligently. In each episode, we discuss a different topic for about an hour or so, with the goal of being to help people tap into and reclaim their sexuality so they can live more intentional, honest, and fulfilling lives.
And more fun.
And more fun, yes. For our first episode, I want to have a general discussion about what it means to manage one's sexuality intelligently. Prior to working with Steve, I had no knowledge of this. I never saw or heard these three words, managing sexuality intelligently, together in a sentence before. I was just dating and entering into relationships with little to no guidance or thought as to what I was doing, what my needs were, or really any of that stuff. I thought I knew what I was doing, but after working with Steve and absorbing his ideas, I realized there was a lot I didn't know. And through the years, 2 years of working with Steve, by applying what I learned, I have drastically shifted in how I engage in dating, relationships, and sexuality. So without further ado, I want to toss it over to Steve to discuss how he came up with this idea of managing sexuality intelligently.
Well, as you know, I've been working with people convicted of sex crimes, or at least accused of sex crimes, for a long time now. And so often when I talk to them, they're not the usual and customary meme that you would expect based on media. They're not deviants. In fact, they're, in terms of their sexual proclivities, they're generally really, unfortunately, rather boring. I thought I was going to get into some really more interesting things from a sexual perspective, but it was interesting in and of itself because these average everyday guys, kind of the boy next door types, were getting into trouble with their sexuality, and there was no explaining it from the viewpoint of clinically significant sexually deviant behaviors like exhibitionism or pedophilia or any of those kinds of things. So then the other angle that I had to consider was criminality. And again, the vast majority, like 85% of my clients, have never had anything so much as a DUI or anything more than a speeding ticket or a parking ticket. So wondering, okay, so what is it? And I briefly considered the medieval diagnosis, I call it, where it's really based on morality, that they're just bad men who do bad things. But if you ever have met anybody who got into trouble sexually, generally speaking, again, the overwhelming majority are people you'd be perfectly happy to have in your life as friends or even part of the family. So hypothesis after hypothesis proving to be inadequate, I really inevitably got forced into taking a look at why were my clients making such flawed decisions. And then as I listened to them, I realized, like me, they had only their background to fall back on when it came to making decisions. And so if they had a decision to make regarding sex, sometimes they would default to their inner 16-year-old who just wanted the titillation of having a sexual encounter no matter who it was, but which I can understand because, like most people, I like sex, and I can understand why they'd be attracted to sexual pleasure. But it was weird because they were doing that in the face of overwhelming evidence that this was a high-risk activity with a lot of legal downside, a lot of legal exposure, and nevertheless, they would leap to that decision. So I got to taking a look at how, so many of my clients were upper middle class. They were making six-figure incomes. They had great careers. They had wonderful friends. A lot of them had marriages with children. How on earth do they end up making such epic, poor decisions? And as I talked to them more and more, they were either leaning on their inner 16-year-old for the impulsivity, of having sexual gratification, or occasionally they would fall back on their religious upbringing, which usually led them to repress any sexual behaviors or thoughts or feelings whatsoever. And the problem with both is that they're both unintelligent. As a 16-year-old, I don't remember being particularly intelligent when it came to managing my personal life. I hadn't been taught anything.
Mm-hmm.
But, and as a recovering religious person, former religious person, I don't remember anything from religion that was in any degree helpful in terms of managing sexuality intelligently. And my clients had pretty much the same exact experience, whether they were young or old, black or white, whether they were religious or not religious. It really didn't matter. They just had experienced a lifetime of no one helping them to think about sexuality in the way that they would think about their finances. A lot of them had a lot more money than I do. A lot of them had amazing fitness programs where they were incredibly fit and worked out all the time. Some of them had personal lives that in other respects were extremely successful. So there were all these aspects of their lives that where intelligent management was a no-brainer. They just, of course, they wanted to do it intelligently. But when it came to sexuality, it was not even a thing. As you said, it wasn't a phrase in anybody's working vocabulary.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I've been interviewed by reporters where they'd ask me, well, why did so-and-so do the thing they did? And I would make a comment about failing to manage his sexuality intelligently. And one reporter in particular, he was really a bright guy, and he looked at me agog and kind of shrugged his shoulders, said, "Are you kidding me? That's it?" As if, because it's a phrase that we all understand. We understand each individual word, but the thing is, we've never put all three words together in a sentence or in a working concept. And so when I explained that to him in just that way, he thought about it for about 10 seconds, and you could see the wheels turning in his head. And then he got out all of his gear, and we did the longest interview I've ever done.
Really?
Yeah, because he could see what was going on, and he could see his own innate bias that he was overlooking something because the problem was it was easy to understand. It wasn't couched in psychobabble, gobbledygook. There was no jargon to learn. It was just, let's think this thing through.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the two main things, though, you're saying are the repression and the reverting back to your 16-year-old self as far as like what you want.
Yes.
And that's what people, is it? So people kind of get locked in. Well, repression is one thing. Well, I guess, can we go into both of those things? Like
Sure.
Repression, or first let's talk about like our 16-year-old selves as far as, so it's like, I guess you could get locked into that phase when you're 16, when you start having sexual feelings and thoughts when you're a teenager, and then that kind of just transfers over to an adult, and it's almost like you don't think about evolving past that phase or what that even looks like, or how do you see that, I guess?
Well, I see the human race as part of the animal kingdom. And so animals like to mate when they have an opportunity. And I think for human beings, that there's that part of us where, really the problem is, and I think it's the problem with our approach to the environment. If we want to understand nature, we have to understand our own human nature to begin with. And so understanding my human nature that, well, of course I would like sex. It feels great. And there's so many wonderful emotions that go with it. And for the people who are impulsive, particularly when it comes to any kind of pleasures like smoking, drinking, buying something that they really can't afford, there's a lot of immediate gratification in that inner 16-year-old. Where I don't want 16-year-olds to feel bad. It's perfectly normal to be impulsive when you're younger, but with age and maturity, you need both. We become a little more intentional, more deliberative. We start slowing down on some of our impulses for the most part, except for certain target populations that really have a problem with impulsivity for specific mental health reasons.
Mm-hmm.
The repression, you know, one of my pet peeves as a counselor is when my clients come into my office having already diagnosed themselves or their marriages, and they explain to me, I know, it's mainly a communication problem. And my response to them is, well, it probably isn't, because you both seem to speak English very fluently. I don't think it's a communication problem. It's more about what are you saying, and I think that has to do with what are you thinking, and it's your communication will be limited to what you understand.
Mm.
And so this notion of repression, we all want to blame the Puritans for that, but there's plenty of blame to go around for everybody, because I've had every religion under the sun represented in my office, and I've had plenty of atheists and agnostics who never go to church, never have been in a church, and they themselves repress as a technique. In fact, I would say is their primary technique. Sometime back, a very wonderful cleric asked me, so what's so bad about repression? Don't we need repression? And he was so sincere, and it just really touched me that he really wanted to know, and I had to think about it in a slightly different way. And I explained to him what I think is true, that repression is a great temporary mechanism for temporary management. And so, like a tourniquet on a wound that's bleeding.
Mm-hmm.
So if I want to, I meet the beautiful woman at the party, and she's smiling and laughing, and she's got this amazing figure and these beautiful lips. And there's a part of my brain that wants to lean over and kiss her. Mm-hmm. But if I do that, there's going to be all kinds of terrible social repercussions, most likely. You know, I mean, it's possible a miracle could happen, and the next thing you know, we're married and living happily ever after. But that's highly unlikely. You know, more likely, I'm going to get slapped across the face and thrown out of the party and have my reputation suffer. And so repression in that moment is a great thing. Now, repression as a lifestyle, that's a whole different conversation, because sexual energy inside of us is a force of nature. And so we can't just put a cork in it any more than we can put a cork in any of our other physical aspects of our animal cells. We sleep, we need to eat and drink, we need to be physically active and move around. We can't just put a cork in all of that without terrible consequences. And so with sexuality, I need to find a way to manage it, and by directing my sexual energy intentionally, rather than repressing it altogether, like building the world's highest dam so that this river can never get to a lower elevation in any way. It's never going to escape. I'm going to keep it totally contained. That's just not going to work.
Yeah. And especially with relationships, I feel, with repression, because it sounds like, so that in the example you gave with the woman at the party, that's in a public scenario. But then even in private scenarios with couples, they're repressing their thoughts, their sexual fantasies, and things that they really would want to say for fear of maybe how the other person would respond. That seems to be stuff that I've researched and learned about from working with you as well. So it's almost like they're afraid to really express themselves, and they just decide to repress and think it's going to just happen somehow, that their stuff gets figured out.
Right. And I think for me, managing my sexuality intelligently means considering things that a lot of other podcasts would never look at as part of sexuality, like mate selection. Mm-hmm. How do we intelligently choose a mate with a higher probability of success in terms of our future marriage than say simply falling in love and marrying the person I fall in love with? And so I use the phrase with my clients, did you really perform your due diligence? They usually want to know, what do you mean? Mm-hmm. So, well, when you buy a new car, do you ever read Consumer Reports or any other information, any reviews about the vehicle you're considering? Well, yeah, of course.
Mhm.
Well, what kind of research did you do on this individual before walked down the aisle? Well, we dated and then they fill in a blank with 3 weeks, 3 months, or a year or whatever it is. I said, well, that's great, but in terms of, did you ever do anything to assess sexual compatibility? What do you mean? Which is a longer way of saying the word no.
Yeah.
No, I didn't do anything. And why didn't we? Well, because our sex education in America is really not in a context of human relationships. We teach sex education as if it's entirely about anatomy and physiology, pathology, and childbirth. So these are the parts. This is how the parts work, and this is what can make the parts sick, and thus endeth the lesson. And I think for most of us, it would be far more helpful if we could learn the things that would go beyond an 11-year-old boy's search on the internet, because that would be something about learning how to have great relationships, learning how to choose mates in a helpful way, learning how to be in a relationship in a way that isn't self-destructive. And we don't do that. So for my clients, I like to talk about performing an intentional interview. And that's as much jargon as I usually use. So an intentional interview would be intentionally getting to know the other person. And it's, of course, one of the major pleasures of human life is getting to know the people we're interested in. And maybe that is a pleasure eclipsed only by the pleasure of somebody wanting to get to know me, wanting to listen to me, plying me with interesting questions, getting me to talk about my background and my beliefs. When it comes to sexuality, though we really kind of don't know quite what kinds of questions to ask, and I'm hoping in this podcast series, we're going to be able to talk about intentional interviews and how to begin getting to know who someone is sexually. Because if we can't use our words, like they talk about in kindergarten, if we can't use our words, typically what we resort to is something I would call the Braille method, where we start putting our hands out there to start touching and see if this touch is okay. Okay, she didn't slap me, so I guess that's okay. And if she did push my hand away, okay, I'll try the left side instead of the right side, or I'll try further delaying rejection by engaging in some other touch that she finds minimally acceptable. And instead of just asking one another, so when you're in love, what kinds of touches are you comfortable with? Which is a pretty simple question, but that question is not really anything that we've learned to ask. We don't learn it in school. We don't learn it in church. We don't learn it from our families. And so we really don't know we have to find out the hard way by, experiencing an experiment and then a possible rejection and then some hurt feelings or some confusion. And then we have to talk about some other things. And it just, we could do so much better.
Yeah. What about people who would say maybe think about, they're like, well, I don't want to talk about it. It's like, it's not sexy or it's not passionate if you're having this conversation. And like, I've had people, and it seems like the majority now of what I'm seeing as far as in this arena of people talking about sex and boundaries and expressing themselves and being able to have these conversations, that the more healthy thing is to have these conversations, because it seems to me like if you don't, maybe in quote unquote, it's more passionate or more loving or whatever people are saying about it, but it also causes trauma. It seems.
Yeah, for me, that's the romantic equivalent of the program Jackasses. Where people are jumping off of a roof. And so I'm just going to try it and see how it works.
Okay, yeah.
But really, it's for the right sort of person, it's incredibly interesting. Now, I've over the years, I've had many clients look at me in dismay and say, but I'm a spontaneous person. Yeah. I like things to be spontaneous. I just want to do things. Well, Do you do that with finances? Do you do that with
Mm,
your workouts, or do you show up with a plan in your mind? Do you do that with, when you take a vacation? Do you have any destination in mind at all, or any idea how you're going to get there? Or do you just, okay, let's get in the car and go?
yeah.
And whether or not you have a tank of gas, and whether or not you know the way, and whether or not, I mean, of course, we have plans for every other aspect of our life, including the aspects that we find most pleasurable.
Mm,
And it is an exceedingly wonderful pleasure for a healthy human being to get to know somebody they're romantically interested in,
mhm.
to have the chance to interview her and get to know her and know what makes her tick. Even I'll go so far as to say, even if I run smack into a real deal breaker, let's say I'm the sort of person who um, say I don't care for tobacco products and I don't want Pete to live with anybody who uses tobacco products. And she drops something in our conversation about how she's really cut back on cigarettes and she only smokes a pack a day now.
Mhm. Oh, so
And
she's really cut back.
well, some people smoke a lot. So, and my, for me, even though I may be somewhat disappointed, because for me that would be a deal breaker on a personal level, and I don't
Mhm.
have any moral judgment for cigarette smoking. I just don't want to be around it. But for me, it takes off a certain amount of pressure so that the interview can become even more relaxed,
Mhm.
because I'm thinking, okay, so this isn't going to work out. Then let's see how much I get to know about this person. And I'm not just, one of my readers from Psychology Today complained, well, you're talking about an interrogation. Well, if you're with someone you find sexually and romantically attractive, and you're conversing with them and getting to know them, and it isn't pleasurable, then you're doing it wrong.
Mhm.
It's just like sex.
Mm.
So it's supposed to be very pleasurable, even if there are real deal breakers that come up. And I had another client say to me, well, why would you even continue talking to somebody if there's a deal breaker?
Mm.
Well, there are two reasons. One, of course, is it's very pleasurable. And, how long have you been smoking? Why do you think you kept smoking? I mean, everybody knows it's bad for their health. What keeps you smoking? I would want to know what's going on in her brain and
Mhm.
where did it all come from. I find that endlessly fascinating. And what we're talking about is a lunch date or a dinner date. I mean, it's not like it's going to cost me a lot of time to find out the answers to these questions.
Mhm.
And if she gets defensive, I could say, I really don't have any judgment about this. I'm just really wanting to get to know you. And I mean that sincerely. And it comes across, I think, sincerely when we're really, meaning it that way. Because I'm not looking for an opportunity to thump her with my Bible of good living,
Mhm.
so that she can be more like me in every way. I'm really looking to just understand her. So that's reason one.
Mhm.
And it's pleasurable. Reason number two is, even though I've been doing this for an awfully long time, my interview skills, my intimacy skills in general, can always stand improvement. I I get better with practice. So the more I am talking to someone and trying my best to make it safe for them to reveal to me who they are, using my own, not just questions, but my own disclosures, my own openness, I think that helps me for the very next interview. So it doesn't matter what the outcome of any one interview is.
Mhm.
It's the business of learning how to talk to people in an intimate way.
Yeah. Cool. I want to go back to really about how we were talking about the clients you work for, people who've committed sex crimes and things like that. For the people out there who, because the first thing that most people think about when they think about that population is that they are like evil, that they're inherently. But again, just to reiterate, you're saying that it's mostly that's never the case. But was there ever a case within your 30-year career that you did run across anyone that was like that, or like what are the statistics, just to kind of just to get an idea of that sort of thing?
Well, I've worked with some really tough cookies who were horribly flawed human
Hmm.
beings who did terrible, terrible things. I think my objection in talking about this, matter intelligently, is that the notion of evil, although it's deeply ingrained into our culture, is ultimately extremely unhelpful because it's unscientific. And by that I mean it doesn't allow us to predict future human behavior, and it doesn't allow us to prevent harmful behaviors. So I reject that medieval diagnosis, but there are very troubled, mentally ill people among us. And I'm not trying to say mental illness is the equivalent of sexual predation, but there are people. Well, okay, let me put it this way. Since I'm rambling on, at any given moment in our culture, the person who is dating has to remember that 1 out of every 3 people they might potentially date is mentally ill. And mental illness is mental illness, not because it's meant to be a hurtful label, but because the diagnosis satisfies the diagnostic criteria, and those criteria are always about some level of impairment. So when we say someone is mentally ill, whether it's depressed or anxiety or something that I find a little scarier, which is, say, a personality disorder, it means that in some fundamental human way, they're not able to be fully human. And for many of us, I've had depression myself. And yes, of course, I was impaired during the time I had depression following a divorce, but it doesn't mean that it's incurable. The vast majority of our mental illnesses are completely curable, and a number of the remainder are certainly treatable and can be managed intelligently. And there are only a few where people really just don't want help. I'm thinking of the typical antisocial personality disorder. We usually use the phrase psychopath to describe them. But the psychopath doesn't ever really want help because they get off on showing themselves how wonderfully smart they are and how terribly stupid everybody else is. And they enjoy that. It's the phrase from the old days was egosyntonic. It's egosyntonic for them, whereas for somebody who's depressed, the depressed person typically knows they're depressed. They know they feel bad. They want help. They want to get over it. But the psychopath, although a psychopath can pretend to be interested in therapy if he thinks it's going to give him some advantage, him or her, he doesn't really want help, because why would he want to be stupid like the rest of the cattle out in the pasture? So there are those people, but they too are diagnosable. They're capable of being understood scientifically. Should a dangerous psychopath be allowed out of prison? I don't think so. But the problem is they can be very charming, and they can be very deceptive, and especially for people who are new at figuring out who they are. So I have horrible stories, but the federal government at the Center for Sex Offender Management, they have a study that was a pretty big one of about over 17,000 ex-convicts who'd been incarcerated for sex crimes. And over a 3-year period, their recidivism rate was 5.3%. And that compares to a recidivism rate that's for people who have not been convicted of a sex crime yet, but they've been convicted of something else. They have their own rate of sexual criminality too. And it's lower, but it's not so low that it's non-existent. And so when you look at the next 100 sex crimes in your community, are they going to be perpetrated by a previously convicted offender? Almost never. The vast majority of them, like 99 out of 100 or more, are going to be perpetrated by a friend or family member, a neighbor, usually somebody in our lives, occasionally a stranger, but it's people that we trust, and to call those people evil. Here's why it's so unhelpful. We didn't know them to be evil before the sex crime, so there's no possibility of predicting that, right? They were all so incredibly sneaky, those minions of Satan that they were. And for them to then commit a sex crime we're horrified, we're appalled, and now they're a sex offender. We've labeled them that way, and now they're evil, and we don't need to ever be taken unawares again because now we've labeled them properly. But almost none of them reoffend. So it's like a magician with the art of misdirection. We are focused on the previously convicted people, but because they're so normal, I assure you, I mean, it's so traumatic to be arrested and then adjudicated and then incarcerated, or even just to be on probation and having a parole officer or a probation officer monitor your behavior and monitor your internet usage and all of that. It's extremely painful and humiliating, and no normal guy wants to repeat that experience.
And is that the main reason why? Just when they go through that process of being arrested and going through that, and are they getting help? I mean, because you have a group out here of men that you talk to, and you start explaining these concepts about being more intentional and intelligent about your sexuality and how to navigate it in a way that isn't going to lead to future crimes, or like, but how does that work on like a national scale? Or is it just because they are normal and they realize they messed up and they go through this process of getting arrested and having to register as a sex offender, and then it's just is the shock of that? Or are there programs all throughout the country that?
Well, everybody who was in that federal study and who accumulated that percentage of 5.3%, they all knew what it was like, and yet they reoffended. In my program for the last 5 years, the recidivism rate has been 0.0%. And I attribute that to some really simple interventions, because the vast majority of people who commit sex crimes, and I'm not including the psychopaths among us, but those who are the relatively normal people, are typically, as Dr. Adler, a contemporary of Sigmund Freud, said, they lacked success in 3 major areas: career, friendship, and love. And some of them did have some success, for example, in making money, but it wasn't a career that really interested them. They were, say, pressured into it by their parents. Even if they were married, it wasn't that they were merely married. It was also that they were married unhappily. And in terms of friendship, almost all of my clients are incredibly isolated at the time of the crime. So, and the rate of unemployment, regarding career, the rate of unemployment is multiples of the general population. So with my clients, yeah, we do talk about career, and friendship is an integral part of the program, but also learning to manage sexuality and intelligently is part of it as well. And because, one of the first reactions everybody has when they get arrested is, well, I don't want to even talk about sexuality. That's what got me in all this trouble. I don't want to date. I don't want to think of women. I don't even want to go there.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you're only 30. And you're not going to be celibate for the rest of your life. So at some point, we're going to need to talk about what would that be like. Where do you usually meet the women you get involved with? And you'll hear stories about, usually it's at the bar, or it's at some nightclub, or it's at some other rather unhelpful venue, that where they really don't have an opportunity to encounter a target-rich environment, as they say in the military, of desirable, compatible, normal human beings to associate with, whether it's another man for a platonic friendship or a woman they might like to ask out. So one of the things my clients, to a man, all want a girlfriend eventually.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the problem. They want a girlfriend, as if women are interchangeable generic parts. And no, the remedy is finding the right woman with whom you can share your life. But before you can find a woman who would want to share your life, you have to have a life worth sharing. And before you can have that, you have to create that.
Mm-hmm.
And for a lot of my clients, that, again, the vast majority, apart from their romantic and sexual lives, their lives are really quite boring and uneventful even to them.
Yeah.
So whatever it would be that would make their life interesting and fulfilling, whether it's career or friendships or hobbies and activities and sports, or finding a personal mission that informs them and guides them to accomplish greater things with their life. They haven't given any thought to that kind of thing. And what's wonderful about it, for a man, if you do that, is that he can then feel less needy. I think every woman listening to this right now knows what it's like to encounter a really needy man. It's a little bit like some of our encounters with poodles, humping our leg. But because
so needy in the fact that they're just trying everything they can to just please this person.
Yes, or to get with her, or to say what he thinks she wants him to say, and there's some of that on the other side as well, of these heterosexual relationships. But it's really, I don't think, at all helpful to go into any negotiation, because that's what a sexual contract is, like marriage. It's not helpful to go in there from a position of neediness, because it's like the guy who needs a car right now going onto a used car lot. He doesn't have a lot of room to negotiate, to hang back and wait for a better opportunity. So he's got to decide right away. And that's one reason I just would encourage people to manage their sexuality intelligently, because for some of my religious clients, being a good person means never having sex until you're married. But that's a little bit like saying, well, yeah, but you're never going to be able to eat home cooking until you get married. I mean, it's really, that would just be awful and untenable. And I don't know anybody who could stay celibate like indefinitely while they're waiting for the right person to come along. And so it's kind of a prescription, another religious prescription that ends in disaster and divorce, if not just profound unhappiness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, so shifting a little bit again, so going back to your own relationship. And so you were married prior to doing this work, and you went through a divorce, and then you became a therapist, and then you just so happened to come upon this population. So do you feel like your own personal life and your own divorce then led to you doing this work with this population? Then did this help you come up with the concept of, did that sort of help click this sort of relationship technology into place?
Well, I think more generally, it's true that because I come from a very troubled family background, with a fair amount of criminality in my family, that I've always, I was so young when my own father was shot to death by the police that I really couldn't do anything to help him escape that fate. But as I grew older, I realized, once I got over myself and realized, yeah, I really should become a therapist, because therapy had really helped me overcome some of my problems. And once it became acceptable to me, I realized I really want to work with so-called bad boys who are accused of or convicted of serious crime. And I started working with violent offenders, and eventually, I ended up working with sexual offenders who were often considered violent offenders, even when their crime has nothing to do with violence. And I think at the end of the day, it feels like suspiciously Freudian to me, because it seems to go back to my dad and my grandfather. But for me, it's been such an honor to help these men and to really learn from them. The way, I'm old enough to remember Betty Ford, and when she came out as a pill-popping drunk, and how brave she was in doing that, and how suddenly the word recovery was on everybody's lips in America. And therapists were on the cover of magazines, and everybody was talking about how alcoholism was really a disease, and that it needed treatment, not moral condemnation. Because back in the day, we used to just call them fucking drunks. We didn't call them people who needed treatment. Mm-hmm. And we've fumbled our way into treatment models that I think are starting to work better, but our first efforts at this were really bad. And I think at the end of a few years of working with drug addicts and alcoholics, we all can see, oh, okay, they are but a type. They are like a meme for the dysfunctional family, because you could have a perfectly sober family and it could still model the same shortcomings as an alcoholic family or a criminal family. And once you see that, then, oh, okay, I can see how I myself, even though I don't have a drinking problem and never have had, I too may need some help. And I think with working with people who are labeled sex offender, the reward has been studying and understanding these individuals has really opened doors of understanding into understanding myself and my own sexuality.
Mm.
And it's resulted in my doing a much better job in my second marriage than I ever did in my first marriage. So my first marriage was instrumental in teaching me that I'm really not that together.
Well, and how old were you when you got married?
I was terribly young. I was 20, she was 18.
And where did you get your ideas of relationships? And I mean, because
When I was 20?
yeah, did you get
Oh
those
my goodness.
from?
So I was very, very religious, unlike my family. I had turned to religion in an effort to be totally unlike my family.
Okay, and when was that? How old were you then?
Oh my gosh, I was 16.
Okay,
And then
and which religion was it? Sorry.
well, I went back. Christianity in general was the religion, but I tried several different flavors of that, looking for the truth. And from Methodists to Lutherans to Greek Orthodox, and lots of visits to lots of other churches, and lots of time spent in non-denominational churches, both charismatic and non-charismatic. And by charismatic, I mean the ones who speak in tongues and do all of that.
Wow.
So I did it all.
And were you not having sex as a kid then? Like when you were younger?
Well, when you say kid, I wasn't having sex till I was 16.
Okay.
But religion was very helpful in helping me to feel guilty about it.
All right.
Right. So I just knew I was wrong and I shouldn't. And the only way I was going to make it right was to marry someone before I had sex. And so I foolishly, I think as a young person, maybe you can forgive me, those who are listening, I just really thought I knew it all. And I really thought, as long as I'm not like my family, I am doing the right thing.
Okay.
But the right thing is so much bigger than not doing one thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I didn't drink, and I never was drunk, and I didn't abuse drugs, and I didn't gamble, and all of these other things that so many of us, quote, good, unquote, men do. And I prided myself on not doing any of those things. But that state of sobriety and goody two-shoes kind of existence, that wasn't enough to keep me from hitting bottom and needing therapy for myself eventually. And I think the mistakes that I made, so much of my youth, frankly, was spent reacting to my family, that I became a control freak. Mm. And my religion and my addiction, if you will, would be to be controlling of all things. And of course, only for your better good. You know, yeah. I mean, I was only doing this for you, not for me. And it was a horrible way of existing. I think anybody who knew me back then, I think, found out probably pretty hard to suffer my presence, because I was always eventually getting critical and controlling. And it wasn't until, after my divorce, which was just what I needed, frankly, because it was an epic failure. And I had resisted during the almost 18 years I was married, I had resisted failure all those years, stubbornly holding out, knowing that if I tried harder, I could make it work. But that was foolish.
And when did you first recognize that you had to start trying harder? Or like, were the beginning years good? Were there good times? And then, like, when did it shift to where you started seeing?
The first week or so was really good. And then my former partner, she started melting down emotionally, and then physically getting abusive. And And I just kept thinking, I just need to love her through this. I need to love her out of this. And because that's all I had really learned. I knew I didn't want to hit her because that's something my father had done with my mother. But I eventually got there because I kept repressing my feelings about getting hit until I was covered with bruises. And then one day she came to hit me again, and I slapped her, and she then she got really mad, and then I slapped her again, and she sat down and started crying. And I didn't hit her after that. But even like 13 years later, she said, I really want to hit you right now. I'm so mad at you. And the only reason I don't is because I know you'll hit me back. And at the time, I foolishly thought to myself, well, good. And I thought, okay, problem solved. We're not going to have any more violence. But that everything I did was a crime, and everything I did was something I could have been arrested for. And it's not the way I would handle those things at all. I think there's an implied warranty, isn't there, in a loving relationship, that the other person will not try to kill you. So yeah. And I think when when it gets to that point where it's violent, they've totally violated any warranty that the marriage might have had. In fact, now it's a marriage in paper only, and it's really time to get out and to move on. And I didn't do that. So I stubbornly hung in there. And even one time we had a conversation, again, 13 years into it, and I stayed another 5 years after she said that, yeah, I really can't give you love. And at first I was very hurt and disappointed and angry for like a nanosecond, and just a fraction of a second. And immediately my codependent self kicked in, and I thought, oh, I just really need to help her. And after 5 more years of that, I found myself engaging in this sort of life that I was miserable, and I found my eye wandering. I was looking at other women. I was just constantly an affair waiting to happen. And I was turning into one of those guys with his shirt unbuttoned, wearing gold chains and driving a sports car. And it was just, I didn't really do that.
Oh, okay. So I was just picturing you doing all this.
But I saw that as like the inevitable result if I kept going down this road. And that's when we separated. And then later she found the courage to divorce me, which was the right decision. And then
do you think you would have ever got divorced if she didn't divorce you?
I don't know if I would have had the courage. I think just separating, though, felt amazing. And I think she probably liked it too. There's a rule in divorce. I think the first person who remarries loses. And she divorced me one day, and that week I think she married somebody else.
That week?
Well, yeah. I mean, divorce papers take a while to get signed. And the moment she was free, she got married. But it was the same marriage. She repeated the same thing. So some of my failed marriage was about me, and some of it was about her. And that's why I don't like to talk about evil, because I don't think she was evil. I don't think I was evil, but we did fail. We failed in our attempt to have a really great relationship. Well, how could we not? It's one of the most complicated, difficult things human beings can do. There are lots of people who make lots of money in the United States, and there are lots of successful people in other fields by other metrics other than money. But there are very few people who are living in truly happy marriages. Very few. And that's really one of my motivators is I want everybody to know what I know and to have what I have, because just like my first marriage was hell on earth, my second marriage, going on 30 years now, has been heaven on earth. It's been amazing. I want everybody to have a relationship like the one I'm enjoying. Whether they're gay or straight or young or old, it doesn't matter. Just to have an abuse-free relationship, something I hope we can talk about in the future. And all the other qualities that can make a relationship work. But I think it starts with managing sexuality intelligently, because mate selection is a huge part of managing my sexuality.
So then you got out of your divorce then, and you were completely shattered. No, were you
pretty shattered? Because I even though I had initiated the separation, the blow to my psyche of having failed so egregiously just really, really bothered me. And so I went into a depression. I was depressed for the better part of at least 6 months. And it was only after I'd done about one lap around the calendar that I started feeling really a lot better. I was going to my own therapist at the time, and I got a rather uneven level of care that in hindsight I try to do better than what I received. But I think we're all doing the best we can with what we've been taught. It's just that this is an area of healthy living that most of us haven't been taught how to have a great relationship.
Yeah. And during that time then, so what were what were you doing for work if you weren't a therapist?
I
Uh,
had just finished school or was finishing school.
at the end of the divorce?
No, right at the time my marriage was breaking up. In
Oh,
fact,
okay.
it's something of a truism. There's a graduate school is very hard on marriages.
Hmm.
And part of the reason for that is you're learning more about what you want to be when you grow up, and you're transform. I was in a relatively small class of graduate students earning uh, their academic background to apply for marriage and family therapy licensure, and there was a very high level of divorce in the group. And a lot of us, I think, were just going to school rather than going to a therapist
Okay.
to learn. So God said, we
Uh-huh.
thought God said, become a therapist, when really what he said, I think you need to go see a therapist.
Mhm.
And maybe if I had gone to see a therapist, that might have helped. But I was meeting all these people who were more my tribe, intelligent people who were interested in relationships, who were analyzing how to help people, and that cast such a shadow over my personal life. And I think that was a large part of my eventual divorce. But then, once I got my degree, and I went right ahead and opened a private practice, and I was going through my depression in my private practice. But like so many depressed people I've talked to, work was actually very therapeutic. Work was where I got to forget about me and pour myself into another activity.
Mhm.
And of course, I've been teased over the years of being the marriage and family therapist who had been divorced, but that's actually pretty common.
All right.
And then, and my divorce, again, I can't emphasize how incredibly important it was in my own personal growth and helping me to just embrace my lack of perfection,
Hmm.
to embrace the idea that I don't really know everything, and that even when I'm most sure of myself, I could very likely be very wrong about any opinion I'm holding on anything. And I think that attitude has helped me approach my clients in a more humble way, and to be very open about making mistakes when I diagnose people or attempt an intervention that I think is going to be helpful, but maybe it's not. And so for me, my clients are always my colleagues,
Hmm.
and we are co-therapists together trying to solve a problem that they have. And that is how I try to treat it.
Great. And then when you were going through that phase of becoming a therapist and working with different people and meeting your next wife, you were starting to put into practice some of this stuff about managing your own sexuality intelligently and being more intentional. It
Oh
seems like.
yeah, starting with just admitting to people that I was divorced, that was extremely calming to a lot of people because they knew I wasn't going to judge them.
Mm.
And then it was also very helpful for them to kind of adopt a more humble attitude, as I had, because it made life so much easier than the pressure of being a know-it-all and trying to be the answer man for every single question on earth. And I think that eventually it parlayed into, for me, helping clients who had a criminal background, and then I've noticed when it comes to people who do have any kind of criminal background, they end up in usually some sort of program, and it's pathetic, really. I'm a big critic of the mental health industry because the people who need the help the most, and the people our society needs to help the most, like violent offenders, sexual offenders, they typically get the worst help offered by the worst helpers.
Okay.
So being able to come into, I had the same experience with people convicted of domestic violence, for example, as I had people convicted of sexual crimes. Back in the 90s, people who committed domestic violence were just wife beaters, and people just hated them. And the men were ashamed, and they would come in. But then when you got to talking to them, you would realize, oh, this was just a really flawed relationship. And then I adopted this saying that angels don't marry demons. We all partner up at roughly the same level of spiritual evolution. And if I have a very flawed relationship with a very flawed person, I need to start looking in the mirror at myself like, why did I pick this person? What is that about me? What does it say about me? What does it say about me that I'm still with them? And my clients responded to that, and they also responded to the idea that they needed to change their ethos because they really weren't wife beaters. They didn't need to stop fighting physically. They needed to seek an abuse-free relationship. So I don't know how much time we have left to get into that, but maybe next time.
Yeah, we could say that for another time. But you definitely, your whole world changed from that divorce, and you shifted.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Because like from what I know just because I know the information from working with you, like you and your wife, for instance, started having very long conversations and really kind of talking about this relationship technology.
My current wife?
Yes.
Yeah. We did have very long conversations where I shared everything about my past and what was going on and my thought life and how I wanted. And I asked her, we met over the phone and we didn't meet in person for many months.
And it was like thousands of hours of conversation.
Well,
so it's like, I'm just going back to like the beginning with like doing a car research or researching your finances or going in with a plan. Like you were being so much more intentional.
With
your own thing.
Absolutely. And so I asked her at one point as we became more personally involved in our telephone conversations, which transitioned from business to eventually becoming very personal. I asked her if she would ever be interested in having an abuse-free relationship based on equality. And I don't know if other people can say that with a straight face, but I did. And she said, there was this long silence. And she said, I've never dreamed of anything so wonderful.
Wow.
And so we talked about that and what it would mean. And I think it's a subject worthy of another hour conversation someday.
Great. Cool. Well, that's, we could wrap up from there. And that's just a little taste of some of the things we'll be talking about. We talked about so much of the different things, the intentional interview, the abuse-free lifestyle. I mean, there's endless topics that we'll be getting into as we continue on in this podcast. And this was kind of just a general overview of how you came up with the concept of managing sexuality intelligently. And I really appreciate you sharing with us. And
oh, you're welcome. It was
my
pleasure. It was my pleasure.
And,
I live for these kinds of talks, actually.
Cool. Well, yeah. Well, it'll be nice to get into the more specific things like intimacy as well. I mean, sex addiction. I mean, there's so many topics to really kind of delve into. And if you like what you hear, stick around. There's gonna be so much more. And yeah, that's a wrap.
Well, thanks.
Yeah, cool. Thank you all for listening, and see you in the next episode.